morning. The Minister of Finance read his first medium-term budget framework about 18 hours ago. By now, the details, the bookkeeping of the budget is well known to everybody. Just a quick summary. He very frankly pointed out that the prospects for the economy in the short term are not all that favorable. Finance has downgraded their growth prospects in line with most others. And he really did not paint a very happy picture, a rather bleak picture, in fact. And for that, I suppose, we need to be grateful that finance treasury is not being over-optimistic. But frankly, in many respects, his first real baptism of fire was a very boring non-event. In essence, a collection of wishes. It was a wish list. And really no real substance was provided regarding some of our major concerns in the economy. If anything, one would imagine that foreign investors and local investors were not encouraged by what he had to say. It looks as if the budget deficit is going to be bigger than anticipated and remain fairly big for the next couple of years. That means that government debt, already disturbingly high, is heading towards 60%. And I suppose the chances of a further credit rating downgrading are becoming firmer and firmer over the next few weeks and months. Let's rather talk about some of the real fundamental concerns in the economy. Obviously, the first one is that as a nation, we are collectively living beyond our means. Not only the government, I've just spoken about that, but we should also point out that household spending over the last 10 years or so has exceeded household income. So along with the increase in government debt, we've also seen an almost equally large increase in household debt. Then, as a nation, we spend more than we produce, which implies we have to import more than we export. So our current account is in a perpetual, fairly large deficit. The upshot of all of this is that we are simply not, as a nation, saving enough. And Basic Economics 101 tells us the prerequisite for reasonable and decent economic growth is a fairly high level of investment, and that in turn requires a fairly high level of savings. I think we all know that to really reduce our major economic problems, this country requires an economic growth rate of at least 5% for about 20 years. For that to happen, we need to allocate about 30% of our GDP every year to investment, and then correspondingly about 30% towards gross savings. Currently, our investment rate is barely 20%, and our savings rate is barely 16%. In short, we are living beyond our means, and then hoping that in some miraculous way, the rest of the world will always be willing to finance that shortfall. And sometimes they do. Right now, they are becoming more and more reluctant to do so. Then, another major long-term pervasive problem is, of course, very poor productivity performances. Labor productivity, growth there the last few years has been barely 1%. Notwithstanding that, wage increases have exceeded 5, 6, 7% for a number of years, which means, amongst other things, that the costs of labor are rising. It also means that we're becoming less and less competitive. And talking about being competitive, the third big obstacle out of many is institutional decline, both in terms of capacity and integrity. A few weeks ago, the World Economic Forum brought out their latest global competitiveness report. A year earlier, this country was ranked 47th out of 138 countries. We are suddenly ranked only 61st out of 138 countries. And we have seen over the last year a disturbing regression in our rankings in areas which previously we've not been doing too badly in, and especially our institutional capacity. And institutions matter for economic growth and development. In all fairness, it's not up to the finance minister to address all of these problems. He was, and still is, obviously faced with an almost impossible quandary: getting the bookkeeping right in the budget, but also hopefully trying to create the platform for future longer-term economic growth. One doesn't expect that a budget framework should and could even address labor issues. We can't expect the Minister of Finance to be solely responsible for institutional issues. But one is disappointed about the fact that he really just did make a bunch of promises and in many cases simply said, well, the detail is forthcoming. The detail will be revealed next year in the budget speech. Indications are, chances are, that in next year's budget speech we will have to see some kind of tax increases. At the moment, for this fiscal year, there seems to be a deficit of 50 billion rand. Now, when you have a deficit, you either make it up by earning more revenue through taxes or by borrowing more money. Neither one of those is a very exciting prospect. Taxpayers are, as it is, hard hit by very high tax burdens, and borrowing more money in a climate of potential further junk bond status would mean at the very minimum to be able to borrow the money, paying far more for it than before. As it is, about 15% of the annual budget is allocated to paying interest on previously incurred debt. That means for every 100 rands worth of tax that you and I pay, only 85 rand is available for spending on education and health and infrastructure and the like. I'm afraid the upshot is that for the next year or so, at best, economic growth will be mediocre. And looking beyond that, unless we really do start saving a bit more and improving productivity and restoring the credibility and the integrity of our institutions, mediocre growth could be the long-term reality. On a slightly more positive note, growth this year maybe 0.6%, a little bit better than last year, and next year maybe 1.1%, a bit better than this year, a bit better, but better is better. And inflation seems to be, well, receding somewhat. A year ago or so, we had a combination of falling growth and rising inflation. We're now looking at a slight increase in growth and a slight decrease in inflation. This does give a bit more breathing space in terms of policy. We saw earlier this year interest rates dropping slightly. Maybe this is indicative of a slight relaxing of tight monetary policy. Then, in conclusion, I'm afraid even these rather mediocre growth prospects are at risk. We have yet to see the real effect on the economy of the recent junk bond status. The lingering and growing uncertainty as we move towards the end of the year regarding leadership of the ruling party and what follows from that continues to create uncertainty and nervousness. In the USA and other parts of the world, interest rates are starting to increase. That this could lead to a capital flow, a capital flight to countries like the USA at the expense of emerging and developing economies. The situation in China remains uncertain, growth is certainly slower, and commodity prices are still rather sluggish. So the risks are there, and the big reason for our vulnerability to these risks is we are living beyond our means.